Indict former President Lee Myung-bak on Monday, a day before his 20-day detention period was set to expire. The 12 charges against Lee include bribery, embezzlement, and abuse of power. Since being taken into custody, the former president has refused to cooperate with the prosecution's requests to question him. Prosecutors say they can prove the ex-leader received around $11 million in bribes and embezzled even more through auto parts company Das, which he's suspected to secretly own. Lee's wife and son are also being investigated over suspicions that they also took kickbacks. South Korean President Moon Jaein has sent a letter to the National Assembly calling on Parliament to swiftly make revisions to the Nat'l Referendum Law that was ruled unconstitutional back in 2014. The idea is if lawmakers and the government can agree on a proposal to revise the Constitution, voters should have a say. Our chief Blue House correspondent Moon Jaein reports.
South Korean President Moon Jaein sent his first executive letter to the National Assembly on Friday, pressing the parliament to quickly revise the law on national referendums that was declared unconstitutional back in 2014. The move today is in line with the Blue House Chief of Staff's news conference 2 days ago.
Leaving the national referendum law as unconstitutional is itself an act of challenge to the people's constitutional right and a serious damage to direct democracy guaranteed by our constitution.
In his letter delivered by the President's Senior Secretary for Political Affairs to the Secretary General of the Unicameral House, President Moon expresses worry that we may see a situation where the public would not be able to vote on a constitutional change, even if the political parties came up with a single great bill for a constitutional amendment. South Korea is seeking to amend the Constitution, which was last revised more than 30 years ago, and put the revision bill up for a public vote during the June 13th local elections. However, Seoul's National Assembly has been stuck on the process with the rival parties' lengthy standoff over the proposed constitutional changes as well as over the law on national referendums. The country's law on national referendum was ruled unconstitutional in 2014 for putting a limit on the voting rights of overseas Koreans, with the court's recommendation for a revision bill. The political parties missed the 2015 deadline to revise the act, leaving the law null and void since 2016, which means even if the political parties do agree and come up with a single constitutional revision bill, the people will not be able to vote on it. The South Korean president is now urging Parliament to take action on first making law revisions to allow the Korean people to vote on various national issues and show the political party's sincerity towards amending the Constitution. This as he puts his foot down on carrying out his campaign pledge to put a constitutional revision bill to a referendum in tandem with the June 13th local elections. Moon Jaein, Arirang News, the Blue House.
Meanwhile, in Korea's National Assembly, the government has submitted its proposal for a supplementary budget. It's only been 3 months since the original budget for this year was passed, and the idea of extra spending isn't going down well with the opposition. The Assembly is deadlocked, and it's not clear how or when they'll get down to real deliberation on it. Kim Min-ji reports.
The fate of the government's supplementary budget, worth almost $3.8 billion, is now in the hands of the National Assembly. It'll be used to breathe life into ailing regions of the country hit by corporate restructuring and to help relieve the country's high youth unemployment. Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon is expected to address the National Assembly next Monday and call for the parties to cooperate. The bill will be deliberated on by the relevant parliamentary committees before being put up for a full floor vote, which the government hopes will be during the April session. But it's not expected to go smoothly. The government's first supplementary budget bill last year took 45 days to pass amid objections that it meant a splurge on new jobs in the public sector, and a similar battleground setting is expected this time around as well. The main opposition Liberty Korea party is against the bill, saying it's only been 3 months since the Assembly passed this year's main budget. The Conservatives are also accusing the government and the ruling Democratic Party of Korea of pumping in money to woo voters ahead of the local elections in June.
Our party will not discuss the bill until there's been a clear assessment of whether last year's extra budget created as many jobs as the government promised, and until there's been an analysis of how the 2018 budget was spent. The government should wait until after the local elections, look at the job market then, and draw up an extra budget if needed.
The ruling party has been adamant, however, that an extra budget is a must to tackle the dire situation some regions are facing.
This budget is indispensable to helping local economies and relieving youth unemployment, which could become a disaster. The opposition asks why it's been drawn up only 3 months after this year's budget was passed. If they look at the disastrous state that some cities are in because of corporate restructuring and unemployment, there's nothing they can say. The right time is now.
The ruling party holds only 41% of the National Assembly's 293 seats, so it's essential for them to persuade the opposition. But at this point, there's another factor that could hold things up. Parliament is still at a standstill, with rival parties unable to narrow their differences on either pending bills or amending the Constitution. The two biggest opposition parties have called on the ruling party to compromise on contentious bills they want passed, or they'll withhold their cooperation on all other affairs as well. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
And to tell us more about today's verdict against former President Park Geun-hye, Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung University joins us in the studio today. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
All right, so the court has sentenced former President Park Geun-hye to 24 years in prison. Now, before we go into that, can you first give us an overview of what happened since her arrest in March 2017 up until today?
Right, it was March 17 last year, so it was about a year. She was arrested and we kept into custody right away because of destruction of evidence or that she might flee. So she's been in prison, and there were several notable moments where her fate was taking a turn. One was adding extra counts for NIS bribery charges, and also she refused to participate in the judicial proceedings last October. So since then, she has been an absent figure in trials. And also, I think that today's proceedings shows that the court is putting more responsibility on the president, the higher responsibility in terms of Constitution. So there are a lot of things to unpack.
Now, like you said, Park has boycotted court sessions since last October, and as expected, she didn't attend the verdict today. So how did that go in this regard? Right,
as expected, it was not a positive point, and also the court kind of specifically mentioned that there was no contrite gestures at all. So the court considered it as kind of derogation of her constitutional duty to uphold the judicial system and the constitutional duty to be faithful in the institutions that we have.
Now, let's get to the most important part then. I mean, what was the verdict against Ms. Park?
Well, as you mentioned, there's a 24-year sentence to go with 18 billion won to be assessed on her.
And how many sentences? There were some cases or charges against her as well, too,
right? There were 18 counts. At this point, there are a couple more coming, but at least 16 of them were found guilty, except for those charges where the court considered the prosecution's evidence as insufficient or depleted.
Then how does Ms. Park's sentencing compare to that of Choi Soon-sil, her close confidant?
Well, Choi Soon-sil got 20 years. So I think what was expected was that she'll get at least 20 years. So it's in the range of expectation that the court considered the responsibility or the culpability of President Park heavier than what Choi Soon-sil did.
Right, but it's definitely less than the 30 years that prosecutors had called on for, right?
Right, because of those counts that were found not guilty, so they kind of subtracted that.
Okay, now
it's still a heavy sentence if you think about it.
Yeah,
it's tantamount to a life sentence.
I mean, considering that Ms. Park is 66 years old now, 24-year sentence means that, does that mean that she'll be in prison until she's like 90 years old?
Yeah, even 90.
Wow.
Yeah. Depending on what happens in the appeal, if there is an appeal. But if it stands, then we're looking at 90-year-old release date, probably.
Okay.
Very heavy.
Now, there has been a lot of interest over figures related to this massive corruption scandal involving President Park Geun-hye. Now, tell us more about them.
Right. Other than the Choi Soon-sil, who is kind of a perpetrator in most of the acts, and President Park, former President Park, got the heavier sentence because she was considered an accomplice, not the accessory accomplice to it. So whatever Choi Soon-sil did, same can be applicable to President Park. We heard a list of probably all the upper 10 chaebol companies, the big companies. They were all involved in this. And we know that the biggest fish they thought of all was Samsung chairman Lee Jae-yong.
Right.
But on appeal, his case was gotten a lenient degree, and he was released on a suspended sentence. So that might be an implication where there might be a chance, I think it's a slim chance, but there might be a chance that if the former President Park appeals, there might be some room for the leniency.
Now, I think what's interesting was that this sentencing was televised live, and Arirang News also televised this live. And I think this was the first broadcast for a verdict of a trial from a district court to be televised. So what was behind this decision?
Right. First in Korea, not in other countries. The U.S. has a regular program or the separate channel that dedicates to court proceedings. But in Korea this time around, it reflects the intense interest of the people. And also because of this is the proceedings about the former president, I think there is a national interest and also something to be learned, I guess. But I guess you have to kind of counter that with other interests, such as privacy, or whether this would create the prejudice against this. For example, one of the arguments was that this is the trial court decision, so if it goes to the appeal, the final verdict is yet to come.
Yeah.
So if it creates some sort of prejudice in the public that the sentence is what she deserves, probably it's unfair. But the court has rejected that argument already.
But then the trials and sentencing of Samsung Electronics, Lee Jae-yong, as well as Choi Soon-sil, were not broadcast because the defendants said that they did not consent to their trials being filmed or televised. And we heard that former President Park also didn't want the proceedings to be televised or filmed, but it didn't go that way. So what's the difference there?
Right. It's between the gambit of court's discretion. I think that their main criteria of allowing this and not the others would be that this is a proceeding against the former president who has the responsibility to uphold the Constitution, and the significance of this sentencing is more from a public policy point of view or a public goods point of view, more meaningful to the public. But I think that interpretation could be in many people's minds overreach, because this has become kind of a interest as to how many years she would get rather than the substance of it.
Let's go back in history a little bit. I mean, she's not the first president to be arrested and charged. So tell us how things went with former presidents who kind of walked in the same path.
Well, it's not a happy story. Now, we saw the sentencing of President Park. President Lee Myung-bak is in jail. President Roh Moo-hyun committed suicide under similar circumstances. If we go back, there's Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo standing in the same proceedings before. So you could say that there's several interpretations possible. One is what was prominently figured in today's sentencing is that there is an unfortunate tradition of close illegal nexus between the politics and the business. And that has gone on. We know that. The expectation is it would have cleared up by now, but it hasn't. So that aspect of it is there. But the other aspect is it's somewhat structural. the presidency. We kind of express it as a imperial presidency of Korean Blue House. But whatever a president says or even mentions is translated or goes down as a direct order of the president. So I think that looking back, there are quite a number of occasions where a president didn't even mean to, probably, but it was translated or received subjectively as a compelling or the direct order. I think we heard from the sentencing as well, a lot of the Jebel Chong-su's case, the head of the Jebel's case, the court relied on their subjective kind of mindset that when the president says something, they received it as something that should be followed. If not, there would be some sort of retribution, and that justified a lot of compelling charges. I think it makes sense, but at the same time, it's circumstantial at best. So I think there's some, that was the defense counsel's argument, but I think the controversy will still continue.
And I know this is stretching this a little bit, but I mean, today's sentencing is definitely a shock to a lot of people. I mean, it's 24 years in prison for a former president who has been ousted. So how do you think this could affect possibly the constitutional revision, which obviously seeks to deviate power from the president to more to the National Assembly and to the people? So it's still in the parliament and it's still waiting to be passed. But what do you think how do you think this could impact that?
I think there is a considerable impact to the extent that it is structural. The imperial presidency has a room for abuse, but at the same time, if it goes to the court of law, it's very hard to prove innocent action out of it. So I think it is positive that we're talking about presidency as having more of a checks and balances. This proposed the amendment of the Constitution, either from the president's side or the opposition side, both talks to or envisions some sort of decentralized power centers. Right. So in that sense, I think this is kind of a data point to justify the fact that we have to change the Constitution in terms of top governance.
But then, you know, there are questions over as to giving more power to the National Assembly because, yeah, presidents have been arrested and charged, but then the public has a lot of distrust in politicians as well.
Right. So that's why the LKP party, Liberal Korea Party's proposal might make sense at some point, but at this point, as you mentioned, given the level of distrust of the National Assembly, the question of whether we should give more power to the Prime Minister, who they are contending they should be elected in the National Assembly, whether there should be one of the power centers. Right? I think that if it works well in a parliamentarian system, there might be a chance where the president and also the prime minister might work together well. But those examples are kind of rare and far in between. So if we were going that route, which is perfectly okay, but we have to solve many other problems before we get to that degree.
So I guess at this point, coming back, what's next for President Park now the sentencing has been out?
The immediate question is whether she would appeal. I think she should appeal, not just for her individual, because if it is finalized, then we're looking at the practical life sentence.
Right.
But from a scholar's point of view and even from the general public's point of view, we probably would be better served to look at it further from the appellate court's point of view and looking at it from a more, other than the trial court, the Supreme Court and also appellate court, it tends to be more esoteric about it. I think it would serve us well looking at this question very closely and not really be swayed by sentiments as much as possible.
How do you think this news will be received by others around the world, I guess? I mean, obviously there are going to be reports out there now.
I'm curious about that, and then actually I did the informal polling
okay.
too. I think that, especially from the U.S. media, they are surprised by the severity of this action. Even when this whole thing blew over, the kind of attitude or the opinion of the foreign press is that, well, it's a case of kitchen cabinet run amok, which is, usual in the U.S. And if you think about what Donald Trump is talking about the businesses these days, trash and fake media and all those, it's something that if you're the business, it's a matter of just ignoring it or not just following it as the court thinks that the business has reacted. So there's a surprise there. I think that the best response from our point of view is that Korea has developed this heightened sense of social justice over the years. I mean, we're talking about the long marches and public protests, but
candlelight vigilance.
The whole history of democratization has to do with demanding more on the top governance side. So this is probably a kind of apex of what happened in our political history. We'll look back, obviously, years from now and say we overdid it or underdid it, but this is definitely a landmark case.
Yeah, we've come a long way, definitely. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you.
And that wraps it up for today and this week, but we'll be back next week with more of the day's top stories and an in-depth look at ongoing issues here in Korea and around the world, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.